Every musical genre, metal or otherwise, is always going to have outliers, but most of the time, if you enjoy a specific subgenre and you step into it, you have a general idea of what you're going to get. There is a sort of sense of expectation or general entitlement from people that go into something that they enjoy, understanding that it usually is going to fall into a specific category. And I really want to hammer home in this video the unsung brilliance of metalcore just as a subgenre for doing what very few other metal subgenres or just genres in general are capable of doing. Now, I don't think I have to be the one to tell you that there is a whole host of terrible metalcore out there, terrible deathcore out there, and honestly some of the worst moments in metal came from the metalcore movement, so in no way is it exempt from being shitty. Just like any other genre, there's going to be crap. There's going to be stuff that is just subpar and inferior or outright just tears down the genre's quality as a whole. The brilliance of metalcore's diversity is in no way deliberate, and if anything, I think it is very unintentional in the freak accident happenstance that pretty much brought it about. And the reason for that is how metalcore has always been divided into so many different little factions that can't really agree on how to approach it. Numerous different movements that happened within the metalcore scene caused it to branch out into so many different avenues, to where metalcore is one big tree, yeah, but all the branches are different sizes. Some are more brittle than others, some are more prone to break than others, some are more sturdy, some have a little bit more leafage on them, some of them are a little bit withered, and if you touch some, you might get poison ivy. Just like anything else, if you don't enjoy metalcore, I'm sure you have plenty of reasons not to, but it is the one metal subgenre that I personally disagree with saying you just disavow entirely and can't enjoy. And most of the time when people say that, they are usually only focusing on one specific portion of the metalcore world, and that is kind of where it can get a little bit hairy. Metalcore in its most easy to understand definition is hardcore punk being mixed with heavy metal, and that kind of has been stretched out to mean nothing nowadays. So much so that there are bands that are astronomically different, if not diametrically opposed to each other, sonically, instrumentally, visually, and aesthetically, no matter what it may be. They are just completely polar opposites. They are the antithesis of each other, but they still fall under the same umbrella, and that's why I say it is not deliberate, because some of the 2010s bands that were like the post-hardcore, metalcore crossover bands, the late 2000s, early 2010s, and the crabcore, electronicore scene, MySpace era of metalcore music is just as metalcore as some of the new era of American heavy metal 2000s bands like As I Lay Dying and Killswitch Engage, but by the same token, there are 1990s bands and early 2000s bands like Converge, Botch, Integrity, which were so chaotic and out there and experimental, forward-thinking, much more hardcore punk inspired, but had a lot of other influences coming from a lot of different other subgenres of extreme music, and those bands are still considered metalcore music. You have some bands like Fugazi being lumped in with metalcore even though they were firmly post-hardcore. You have bands that were formed in the late 1980s like Ringworm that are retroactively called metalcore music that would fall more in line with what you would consider hardcore punk music. You have newer beatdown bands like Knock Loose, which are very hardcore punk-esque, but they are very metalcore and firmly situated as being one of the biggest metalcore bands. You have these djenty progressive metalcore bands that had crossover with deathcore like Born of Osiris, Veil of Maya, Vilsharta, as well as Invent Animate, which are still firmly metalcore. They sound nothing like Killswitch Engage. They sound nothing like early Bring Me the Horizon. They couldn't be further from early Converge and what Kurt Ballou did. But all of these bands are called metalcore music, and obviously we can play these little genre games and subgenre games and make up little terminology and put things into boxes for everything, but at the end of the day, let's be real. You're watching a channel that is dedicated to metal music. You care a lot about it. To a lot of people that are just comfort listening or don't really give a fuck about genres, which there's plenty of metalheads that don't. I personally don't care that much about subgenres. They're just going to go with the easiest way to describe something, and so it can be very confusing when all of those bands and movements that I'm talking about all fall under the category of metalcore music. What does a band like Underoath or Hawthorne Heights, some of early My Chemical Romance, have in common with Shadows Fall, or some of the first records from Avenged Sevenfold, some of the early records from Killswitch Engage, or any of the mathcore bands like Dillinger Escape Plan, some of Botch and Integrity, integrity, or like I said, early Converge's works. What do these bands have in common? Does Converge have so much in common with Knock Loose? Does Knock Loose have so much in common with early Bring Me the Horizon, Suicide Season era Bring Me the Horizon? And what do those bands have in common with a band like Within the Ruins on an album like Phenomena, or The Discovery by Born of Osiris? Where do some of the bands like Crown the Empire and The Amity Affliction and We Came as Romans, this kind of more straight true blue 2010s Rise Records type of metalcore, fit in? What the fuck about electronicore? Bands like The Browning, modern bands like Electric Callboy, bands like Icy Stars, which took dubstep and electronic music and put it into metalcore music, Attack Attack, Inner Shikari, or some of the more very punkish bands like Beartooth, which are still firmly called metalcore music more often than not, or a bunch of crossover bands that have a lot of different influences going into them, like Spirit Box or Bad Omens or The Plot in You, some of the post-hardcore bands that are adjacent like Dayseeker or Holding Absence, or a really experimental and underground weird-ass project like Zombie Shark. I'm coming from the perspective of someone that probably likes metalcore more than most genres. It's probably my favorite and most listened to genre and the one I'm most knowledgeable about. But I still love extreme music. I love black metal and death metal and grindcore and gore grind. But 9 times out of 10, if I see an album with that label, I know that it's going to fall into a specific category. And there can be bands that kind of test the limits of that, but most of the time, it's still going to cling to that initial root. A death metal band could be very technical, sure, it's still going to be death metal music. It can be very subterranean, low produced, it's still death metal music. You can have a black metal band that's extremely atmospheric or folk influenced. You can have a very well produced black metal band or a very raw black metal band. It is still going to be black metal at the end of the day and instantly identifiable. But for someone that's stepping into metalcore and seeing how many bands fall under that category, it can kind of leave you scratching your head and being like, what exactly am I listening to, and what are the common similarities, the correlation between these bands? And the line is getting blurred more and more than it necessarily ever has been before. Some of early Lamb of God's works are called metalcore music, and you have modern bands like CU Space Cowboy who take so many different influences, but at their core a lot of times are called a metalcore band. And while metalcore isn't necessarily a new term by any stretch of the imagination, there are a lot of bands, like I said, Ringworm, that are revisionarily, in hindsight, called a metalcore band. And even as someone who absolutely adores metalcore music, I can usually tell the different subgenres within it. It irritates and confuses me sometimes to see how these bands fly under the same banner. It feels like you need other descriptors, because how exactly does that work? Metalcore really is a freak accident. Most of these subgenres that sort of change over time or have different influences come into the fold that make them a little bit unrecognizable at points, it happens organically, it happens naturally and fluidly, and metalcore obviously did too. But even those subgenres, the other genres that came from metal, they're not so far removed that you can't recognize them at all. They're still very comprehensible, and you can definitely see where they're coming from. Whereas with a lot of metalcore music, you have bands that are more mathy, more crazy, more well produced, more commercially viable, more raw, more primitive, more technical, more experimental. Some that are more punk inspired and lean a lot more into the hardcore punk isms, either lyrically or sound wise, sonically, or you have bands that just don't go with that at all and are more heavy metal inspired, or the scene era that pretty much abandoned the punkism entirely and took metalcore in a completely different direction. And then you have the buff tough guy stuff like As I Lay Dying and Killswitch Engage, and it's like, you look at all these bands and you're willing to tell me that Killswitch Engage is in the same lane as Icy Stars and is in the same lane as Early Converge and is in the same lane as Invent Animate and is in the same lane as Ringworm. The rabbit hole goes insanely deep. And that's why I think it is very difficult to write off metalcore and say you don't enjoy it. Because even if you don't enjoy the big choruses of a Killswitch Engage, or you don't like gentiness, or you don't like the scene emo stuff, I promise that at this point, with how many fucking things have happened in the metalcore genre, there's going to be something for anyone. You just probably haven't found it. And I understand if you don't want to kind of put the time in to try to find those bands or find those movements, but I promise you, if you are unfamiliar with metalcore, or you only think metalcore is one thing, you have been sorely misled. You're probably clinging to some sort of old cliche, trope, or stereotype. You're probably leaning into the past a little bit, because I promise you, metalcore has gotten very hard to contain and even harder to define. In my personal humble opinion, harder to define than a term like extreme metal, harder to define than a term like avant-garde or experimental metal, because at least those have a base plate of what you're going to expect going into them by definition, by their name. Metalcore just has so few subgenres that it just gets slapped on any band that even remotely sounds like it could be adjacent to metalcore, and it makes it very confusing to sift through and figure out what you're listening to. Is it even metalcore? And then you stack onto that the infighting of metalcore fans that call things not real metalcore, not metalcore enough. A lot of people disavowed the scene emo mall kind of metalcore music and post-hardcore as not being real metal. It shouldn't even be considered in the same contention as those early 2000s bands. There are people that swear by what's known as like melodic metalcore. That's like the As I Lay Dying and Killswitch Engage, the early 2000s. And then you still have people preying on early Avenged Sevenfold. And then you have people who say that like the early days of hardcore punk, crazy infused mathcore metalcore music like Dillinger and Converge, Botch, Integrity, that's like the real stuff. Or the really buff and gruff stuff like fucking Earth Crisis. Like, these are all metalcore in their own way, and in the same way that the scene emo got critiqued, as well as like a lot of gent and progressive metalcore bands were kind of pushed aside by a lot of purists, those are still metalcore in their own way, even if they are a different breed, and shouldn't necessarily just be called outright metalcore music, because I think metalcore has kind of been stretched a little bit, and I'm not a genre purist. I don't think that something should need to be exactly one way and nothing else. I am all for experimentation and taking genres out of their comfort zone. If anything, I think that's what makes a genre stay fresh and unique and interesting and always forward thinking and boundary pushing. But I think there comes a point where if you just say that so much can be considered the same thing without any other form of other genres, which obviously it sometimes happens with genres like gent and melodic metalcore and stuff, but most people don't really care about those distinctions. It can become a little muddy to understand what metalcore even is, because if the whole thing was metal mixed with hardcore punk, I would say a solid 70 to 80% of the biggest metalcore bands of all time would not fall under that category, and certainly aren't taking influence, at least sonically, maybe subconsciously, but not sonically, from those bands that are supposedly the forefathers of metalcore music. And if anything, it is so rare to even find a metalcore band that is influenced by hardcore punk, dare I say, unless you're talking about some of the older bands that are still making music to this day. There became this long-term obsession with breakdowns and chuggy riffs and that sort of thing, to where metalcore sort of changed its identity entirely. What it meant in the 90s and 2000s isn't what it means nowadays, and that's such an interesting point in metal, because that's very rare. Most metal music is obsessed with the past. It is always trying to standard bear. You look at genres like black metal and death metal, they cannot go 2 albums in a discography without trying to mimic and imitate something from the past. So it's really weird to see metalcore become completely detached from its roots and completely detached from its past in many ways. And there are always going to be bands that are trying to take that into a new direction, but at the end of the day, it's always going to be some form of something that isn't even what it came from. Nowadays, you're seeing it with like the new metalcore movement that's taking from new metal. New metal wasn't metalcore, whereas like the revival of old school metalcore music, the best you're getting is bands like See You Space Cowboy, and they're reviving sort of the scene era of metalcore music. So the 90s and 2000s scene, and I'm talking like the late 80s, early 90s, not late 90s. The early metalcore bands have just kind of been left aside, and you don't see many people trying to actually carry that on into a new era, which makes metalcore simultaneously so genius and brilliant and interesting, fascinating to look at, but also very sad, because it's like, where exactly did that past go and that history go? It didn't rewrite it, obviously, and these bands aren't trying to erase it, and they're certainly influenced by it. And if anything, you see a lot of screamo, like DIY underground screamo music, carrying the memory and sound of a lot of that early metalcore aggression more than like so many metalcore bands nowadays do. And that's coming from someone that fucking loves metalcore music, so this absolutely is a love letter to the genre. But if you think that you know what metalcore is, and if you think that you don't like it, you probably are thinking it is one thing and nothing else, my friend. And I would just try to look a little bit deeper in it, because the history of it just goes so far down the rabbit hole. It is fascinating and incredible to go into, and you might find some good music along the way. I certainly have. What are your guys' opinions of this topic? Do you like metalcore? Do you not? You can let me know down in the comment section below. Agree or disagree. There is no wrong answer. Can't wait to hear your opinions on this topic. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.